The moment you need to understand before anything else is the one that didn't look like a political moment at all. A man in a boxing gym, workout clothes, battle ropes in his hands, no teleprompter, no studio lighting calibrated for comfort, no talking points visible anywhere in the frame, just a 6'4", 290-pound former professional wrestler looking directly into a camera and saying, with the flat, unhurried certainty of someone who has earned the right to define every word he's about to use, "Fellows, we got to talk." Everything that followed was built on that foundation, not on ideology, not on partisanship, on credibility, the specific, physical, irreplaceable kind that comes from a life spent actually being the thing you're describing. Dave Bautista didn't walk into that segment as a celebrity offering a political endorsement. He walked in as a man whose entire body of experience had prepared him to call something what it was. And what it was, in his assessment, delivered without a single raised syllable, was a performance. The choice of setting was not accidental. Every frame of that clip communicated the same thing before a word was spoken. Bautista wasn't in a press room. He wasn't behind a desk. He wasn't surrounded by the visual vocabulary of official political commentary. He was where physical reality lives, where things either are what they claim to be or they aren't. And there is no narrative management capable of covering the gap. He flipped tires. He worked the ropes. He spoke. And the contrast between what was visible in the frame and what he was describing in the clip edits that cut to Trump was so precise it didn't need emphasis. The images did the work. The draft line is where the script found its structural backbone. Donald Trump had his daddy pay a doctor to say his real feet hurt so he could dodge the draft. This is not comedy with a fact buried inside it. This is a documented fact delivered inside a comedy container. And that distinction matters enormously. Trump received 5 military deferments during the Vietnam War era, 4 for college enrollment, and a final medical deferment in 1968, citing bone spurs in his heels. The podiatrist who provided that diagnosis rented his office space from the Trump family. Trump's own former lawyer, Michael Cohen, told Congress that Trump had described serving in Vietnam as stupid, and that the bone spur diagnosis was manufactured. These are not Bautista's characterizations. They are time-stamped public record. What Bautista did was deliver them in 30 seconds with the tone of a man reading from a list he finds mildly exhausting. And that tonal choice is what made the laugh happen, and what made the fact stick after the laugh faded. The laugh is the vehicle. The fact is the passenger. And the passenger is still there when the vehicle parks. The makeup line operates on different terrain. He wears more makeup than Dolly Parton. Trump's use of bronzers, self-tanning agents, and cosmetics has been extensively documented, not by his critics inventing details, but by dermatologists, image consultants, and media coverage spanning more than a decade. His characteristic orange tone has been analyzed by makeup professionals, color system experts, and Washington dermatologists who noted the telltale quality of cosmetic application versus natural skin coloration. His own White House aides disputed the characterization, which itself generated coverage. The point isn't that wearing makeup is wrong. The point Bautista was making, the one that landed, is that the man whose brand is built on raw, unfiltered, no apologies masculinity invests considerable effort in his physical presentation. The gap between the brand and the behavior is the joke. The joke is also the argument. What separated Bautista's intervention from the hundreds of celebrity dunks on Trump that came before it and mostly evaporated within 48 hours was something the script identified correctly as the source of credibility, audience alignment. Trump, particularly in 2024, was polling significantly higher than his Democratic opponent among male voters. Not all male voters, but a specific demographic that had developed a cultural attachment to his persona. The red meat, the UFC, the crypto, the explicit performance of a certain masculine archetype that had been deliberately constructed and consistently reinforced over years of public presentation. The people most invested in that persona were not going to be moved by a journalist, a comedian, a politician, or a celebrity whose own credibility lived in a different universe. They had already decided who those people were and what their critiques meant. But a 290-pound former professional wrestler and Hollywood action star, someone who had actually been in physical pain, who had actually had to be tough in arenas where there was no way to fake it, who carried the specific authority of a man whose body itself testified to his credentials, that was a different category of source. Bautista had access to an audience that most political commentary can't touch, not because of what he said, but because of who he was before he opened his mouth. The personal history behind the political intervention is the part that most people scrolling past the clip never paused long enough to find. Bautista was raised by a lesbian mother in Washington, D.C. That fact is not incidental to his politics. It is the origin of his politics. He described cutting ties with a former colleague and mentor, removing the man's logo from his own body in a tattoo cover-up when that colleague made public anti-gay statements. The break was not a tweet. It was not a press statement. It was a physical action with a permanent cost attached. It's a personal issue with me. My mom's a lesbian, and I just could no longer call him a friend. That sentence is not a talking point. That sentence is a line a man drew for himself years before politics became the cultural theater it has since become. And he drew it at personal cost, and he has held it since. That history is what gave the women's rights portion of the segment its weight beyond the obvious. When Kimmel asked Bautista how important it was for men who looked like him to be louder about women's rights, Bautista declined the framing. He didn't accept the premise that this was a responsibility specific to men of a certain physical type or social category. I think every man needs to be louder about the rights of women. No hedge, no qualification, no men who look like me specifically. Every man. The universality of that position, stated without performance or self-congratulation by someone who had already demonstrated through documented personal action that his stated values had actual consequences in his actual life, landed differently than the same sentence would have landed from someone whose values had never been tested. The anatomy of the roast itself deserves attention because Bautista wasn't simply listing insults. He was dismantling a specific identity. Every descriptor he chose, moody, pouts, tantrums, bends over for Putin, tattles on social media like a middle school mean girl, needs help walking downhill, was the deliberate inverse of the Trump brand's promises to the men consuming it. The brand promises strength. Bautista cataloged weakness, documented and observable, item by item. The brand promises dominance. Bautista described dependency. On his father's money for draft avoidance, on cosmetics for appearance management, on the umbrella held by a nearby aide in the rain. The brand promises toughness. Bautista described a man who, by the record visible in publicly available footage, found the physical requirements of ordinary life challenging, and he delivered all of it at one sustained, even temperature. No screaming, no fist-pounding, no visible anger. The calm was the architecture. The calm is what made it credible, because anger can be dismissed as bias, as agenda, as the kind of performance that reveals the speaker's investment in a particular outcome. Calm registers as observation. Calm sounds like a man explaining what he simply sees, the way you'd describe the weather or read coordinates from a map. When someone who could very credibly be angry, who has personal stakes and documented history with the values being discussed, chooses to deliver their assessment at room temperature, the audience reads it as confidence rather than rage. Confident people describe reality. Angry people argue with it. The wrestling dimension of the story added a layer that most mainstream political commentary missed entirely. WWE exists as a cultural universe with its own tribal loyalties, its own definitions of hero and villain, its own understanding of performance versus authenticity built into its audience's DNA. Every fan of professional wrestling has spent years learning to read the gap between what a performer presents and what they actually are. They have been trained by the genre itself to identify when someone is working the crowd versus when they're being real. Trump's own relationship with WWE, the appearances, the WrestleMania involvement, the specific staging of his public persona, was built on that audience's fluency. He understood, intuitively or by design, that wrestling fans respond to archetypes and to the performance of dominance. When The Undertaker and Kane put their names and their WWE legacies next to Trump's candidacy, they were making a choice visible to that audience in specific terms. When Bautista, who came from the same universe, looked into a camera and said what he said about what Trump actually was, wrestling fans heard it in that specific frequency. This wasn't abstract political opinion. This was a character reveal in a language they had been fluent in for decades. The heel presenting as a face. The man in the ring claiming to be something the evidence didn't support. Wrestling fans of all audiences know how to spot that. The segment's final escalation, the closing monologue delivered while Kimmel watched from the side, stripped the remainder of the distance between comedy and argument. Donald Trump is afraid of rain, of dogs, of windmills, of Meryl Streep, and of being laughed at. But mostly he's terrified that real, red-blooded American men will find out that he's a weak, tubby toddler. The word terrified is load-bearing. Fear is the one thing the tough guy brand cannot absorb. Every other vulnerability, the makeup, the golf cheating, the draft avoidance, can be deflected, contested, reframed. But fear, especially fear of being seen through by the specific audience whose admiration the performance was designed to secure, is a different category of exposure. It implies that the performance is conscious. It implies that the man behind it knows the gap exists. It implies that the gap is precisely why the performance requires so much effort to maintain. Kimmel's final line, "Thank you, Dave. You're an American treasure," functioned exactly as the script identified. The hero didn't declare himself brave. Someone else did. That's the only sequence that works, because self-declared heroism cancels itself. The witness completes the testimony. And Kimmel's witness, delivered straight to the audience after watching the entire segment unfold, confirmed what the architecture had been building toward from the first frame. Bautista didn't ask for the fight. He showed up because something was being stolen in public. The definition of toughness, misassigned in ways he had the specific, personal, physical, documented authority to correct. He corrected it calmly. He corrected it with evidence. He corrected it in 30 seconds in a boxing gym where the ropes and the tire and the body in the frame made the argument before a single word was spoken. That's not performance. That's a man refusing to look away from what was already visible. And that calm refusal, delivered to exactly the audience that needed to hear it from exactly the person who had earned the right to say it, was the only version of this argument that had any chance of landing where it actually mattered.